They say no one waved when the train pulled in, not because they didn't care, there just wasn't anyone left. The platform in Dovetail, once bustling with coal-stained boots and Sunday hats, stood silent under the July sun. A tumbleweed rolled through like it knew it had the whole place to itself. And then she stepped off. One small bag, a worn coat, a letter clutched in her hand creased at the corners from too much hope. Her name was Maribel Dunn, 51. No children, no husband. No reason really to believe in new beginnings. But when you've spent a lifetime being overlooked, you learn how to see things others miss. And she saw it. The peeling storefronts, the schoolhouse with a broken bell, the chapel door swinging loose on its hinge. A town not just empty but grieving. Most would have turned around, sent a letter of complaint, asked for a refund. But Maribel just stood still, then walked straight down the center of the street like someone who hadn't given up on anything yet. What she did next, well, it's the kind of thing no one saw coming. Not the few folks still lingering behind curtains. Not the man with one arm and 5 children watching from the old livery stable. She didn't wait to be welcomed. She brought warmth where there was none, soup to cold hands, words to those who'd forgotten how to speak. She turned a dying place into something that breathed again. But behind that gentle smile, she carried a secret. And when the truth came out, it shook what was left of that town. Why did a woman like her come to a place like this? And what did she leave behind to do it? You may think you know where this story's going, but I promise the heart of it lies just ahead. Because sometimes love doesn't arrive on horseback. It steps off the train quietly and rebuilds a whole town one cracked window at a time. Will you stay to find out what Maribel did next? They called it Wellington, though no one remembered who gave it the name. The sign was half hanging on a rusted post swinging in the prairie wind like it too wanted to leave. No one waited at the station. Not a man, not a horse, not even a dog. Just the hiss of the train pulling away, and a woman standing in the stillness with her gloved hands folded neatly as if they might keep her heart from shaking. Her name was Maribel Dunn, though she hadn't said it aloud in days. On the train, she was ma'am. In the letters before that, she was Miss Dunn or simply the lady applicant. No one had used her first name like they meant it in years. 53. That's what her last birthday had said. A lifetime of being polite, modest, useful. She had once taught arithmetic to boys who now had their own land and wives. She had once packed her trunk to follow a man to Arizona, only to be sent back by his mother, who said her hips were too round to ride the hard years. Maribel had unpacked quietly. She had watched her parents die in the same bed one winter apart. She had sold the house, the piano, the wedding dress no one ever claimed. And then with shaking hands, she'd answered the letter on the church notice board. It was written in pencil, looking for a companion. Town's nearly gone. So's the house. But there's a post, a stove, and space to start again. No money, just dignity. No name, no promises. Just those words, start again. And something in her long quiet stirred. She took her first step onto the dirt road with care, as though she didn't quite trust the ground yet. Her boots were too clean for this place, her bonnet too proper. But she kept walking, one hand wrapped tight around the strap of her carpet bag, the other holding a folded note with an address smudged by time and worry. Wellington was more ghost than town. A few frames of houses leaned into the wind like tired men at a bar. A chapel with broken windows sat across from a dry well. The mercantile had no roof. No one swept the porch of the post office. But the mailbox still stood. Her letter had said, North Edge, last house. Red shutters if they're still up. She walked past empty chairs, a cradle tipped in the dust, a tin rooster still spinning on a rooftop. She walked past echoes of families that had once built dreams with bare hands. It was like walking into a book that someone had closed too soon. And then she saw it. The house was there barely. A kettle muttered soft sounds on the back burner. Maribel stood in the doorway for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. Not just to the dimness, but to the stillness. There were no voices here, no clanging bells or murmured judgments. Just the soft crackle of wood and the slow movement of a man who didn't rush to fill silence. Gideon Ward poured her tea with his left hand. His right arm ended at the elbow. No explanation, no apology, just motion, efficient, plain. like everything about him. I wasn't sure, he said, sitting carefully in the armchair across from her, that you'd come. Most wouldn't. I nearly didn't, she replied and folded her hands over her skirt, but there wasn't much left where I was. He didn't nod, didn't pity. He just sipped his tea and let that sit. Outside, wind rustled the weeds that had long since claimed the town's only street. Inside, something older than conversation began to grow. A knowing, a shared quiet. That first night, Maribel slept in the back room on a bed made from cedar slats and wool batting. The mattress smelled of pine smoke and loneliness, but the blanket, she noticed, had been freshly washed. In the morning, there was bread on the table, rough, misshapen, but warm. Gideon didn't speak much. He showed her where the water was drawn, how the stove smoked, if the damper wasn't just so. He didn't ask what she'd run from. She didn't ask what had cost him his arm. By the end of the week, they'd found a rhythm. She swept and patched the roof with old tar paper. He brought in wood. When a shutter finally gave way, in the wind, they caught it together, nailed it back with hands that didn't need to speak. In town, if it could still be called that, there were signs of what once was. A church bell with no clapper, a schoolhouse with chalk still on the board, empty chairs still circled a fire ring in the dirt. And then the strangest thing happened. On the 8th morning, just as dawn was curling over the edge of the plains, Maribel stepped outside and saw movement by the chapel. A girl. 8, 9. Tangled hair, bare feet. She was kneeling by the well, hands cupped. Maribel approached slowly. "Hello," she said, soft as wind. The girl flinched, then bolted, bare legs flashing, as she disappeared behind the livery. When she told Gideon, he didn't look surprised. "There's a few left," he said. "Kids mostly. Their folks either died or left. Some took sick. Others just gave up. They hide now. Won't come close." "Do they eat?" she asked. He nodded. "What they find. Old tins. Scraps. Rabbits if they're lucky." That night, Maribel left a slice of bread on the chapel steps. By morning, it was gone. She did the same the next day. Then an apple. Then two. On the 4th day, she found a single red ribbon left in its place. Frayed, faded, precious. "I was sent to be a wife," she whispered that night, standing near the fire. Gideon looked up. "But maybe that's not what I'm meant for," she added. He didn't reply, but his eyes held something steady. Respect, perhaps, or awe, the quiet kind. By the 3rd week, Maribel no longer needed a lantern to find her way through the cabin. Her feet knew the creaks in the floor. Her hands reached instinctively for the kettle before dawn. But inside her, the ache of uncertainty still gnawed like wind under a door. She wasn't sure what she was becoming. Not quite a wife, Gideon hadn't asked. Not just a housekeeper, though the windows were cleaner now, the cupboards fuller. Not a mother, not really. But every day more shadows moved at the edge of town. Children who never spoke but watched, listened, waited, and she had started waiting for them too. The struggle was not loud. It didn't shout. It came in quieter forms. An old school desk she dragged back upright. A pie she left cooling on the church steps. A broken toy she repaired with horsehair and twine and placed without a word near the pump. It came in doubt too. Who was she to mend what had broken long before she arrived? What made her think kindness could take root in ash? Late one night, unable to sleep, she stepped outside. The sky stretched above like a black quilt stitched with stars. She heard it then, soft rustling near the barn. A child's breath. Quick, uneven. "Hello," Maribel whispered. Silence. "It's all right. I'm not going to take anything." The silence stayed, but it wasn't empty. It was heavy with choice. She didn't reach forward. She didn't chase. She just sat on the stoop with a blanket, humming an old tune her grandmother used to hum. A hymn without words, just warmth, and in time the breathing calmed. When she rose to go inside, the blanket was gone. She smiled. But the next day she saw the fire, not theirs, further out where the old mercantile once stood. Smoke curled up like a ghost refusing rest. She and Gideon ran, no words, just motion. What they found was worse than ash. A boy, 10 at most, trying to cook a pigeon over open flame. He looked up, eyes wild with hunger. Behind him, 3 smaller children huddled. Bones too close to skin. One girl's feet were blue from frostbite. Maribel knelt slowly. "Come," she said. "We have bread, and soup, and quilts. You don't have to stay out here. But the boy shook his head, teeth clenched. Grown-ups lie, he spat. They always leave. We didn't come to take you, Gideon said quietly. Just to offer a place to warm up. You don't owe us anything. The boy looked at him, looked at Maribel, and for a long moment nothing passed between them but wind. And then, a nod. That night the cabin held more than it was built for. 4 children on the floor, tucked in quilts. 1 woman at the stove humming again. And a man by the door keeping watch not just outside but within. By midwinter the old house had turned into something neither Maribel nor Gideon had words for. It wasn't a home in the usual sense. There were still broken hinges and drafts in the boards. The stovepipe leaned too far left, and the porch creaked under even the softest footstep. But it felt lived in, filled. Laughter came in short bursts now, small bright things that startled the rafters. Little boots dried by the hearth, knitted socks found their way into worn drawers, and Maribel, without announcement, began calling the children by name. Eli, the eldest boy, still kept his guard high, but not as high as before. Junie, with the frost-bitten toes, followed Maribel like a shadow, clutching her skirt whenever the wind howled. Bram, the smallest, had taken to sleeping with the carved wooden spoon Gideon made him. And Nessa, mute but fierce, traced pictures in the dust, with a stick nodding solemnly when Maribel praised her shapes. One night after the children had all gone to sleep, Maribel stepped outside into the cold. The stars were high and sharp. She heard footsteps behind her, slow, familiar. Gideon. They didn't speak at first. Then with his hands shoved in his coat, he said, "You ever think, maybe this was what you were always meant for?" Maribel looked out over the dark hills. "I used to think I was born wrong," she said, voice quiet. "Not the kind of woman men choose. Not the kind that keeps things going. Just someone waiting for the next goodbye." She turned to him. But now, he met her gaze. He didn't ask her to finish, because the now was clear in the way she tucked the children in, set the table, watched the horizon without fear. She wasn't waiting anymore. She was choosing to stay, choosing to give, choosing herself. 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. One of the children had sent it. A shaky note written on torn paper. "There's a town here. It's not dead. We're still breathing." And one by one, others began to arrive. A widow with a baby strapped to her chest. A carpenter missing an eye. A boy with a limp and nowhere else to go. They didn't bring much, but they brought enough. Enough to start putting the mercantile back together. Enough to hammer in new glass panes at the church. Enough to sweep the dust off the old schoolhouse floor. Gideon built benches. Maribel baked bread. And the children began calling the place something new, Hollow's Light, because what had once been a hollowed-out town now held warmth again. And in that warmth, Maribel walked freer than she ever had in her life. No longer a bride with a one-way ticket. No longer a woman defined by who didn't want her, but a force, a fire, a beginning. The snow began to melt in slow silver streams down the hill come March. The road that once led only to silence now echoed with footsteps, cartwheels, and low voices asking, "Is this the place?" Some came for shelter. Others came out of memory. A few came simply because they'd heard of a woman named Maribel who opened her door without asking questions. She never turned them away. And though her hands ached and her back protested with every rising sun, she found herself smiling more often than she realized. Not the careful smile of manners, but the kind that rose from somewhere long buried, somewhere sacred. It was Nessa, the quiet girl, who started calling her mama first, just once. A whisper soft as flower dust while curling beneath a quilt. But it cracked something open. Not in pain, but in grace. Soon the other children followed. Sometimes aloud, sometimes only, in the way they leaned into Maribel's side during prayer or supper as if she'd always been there. A hearth no one had noticed was missing. And Gideon, he remained as steady as ever. A man shaped by loss and forged by solitude. But where there used to be only silence in him, now there was space. Space to listen, to learn, to make things not perfect but good. He built Maribel a garden bed, though frost still kissed the earth. "It's for spring," he said, eyes on the soil. She touched his sleeve lightly. "You believe in it?" He looked at her, then really looked. "I do now." And that was enough. That night, under the oil lamp's soft glow, She opened the ledger from the old general store. She flipped past brittle pages of unpaid debts and faded ink until she reached the blank ones at the back. With careful strokes, Maribel began to write. New families, new trades, new needs, children's names, birthdays, bits of laughter, notes of bread shared, chairs carved, lessons taught. History wasn't just a story of what had been lost. It could be a record of what had been chosen, reclaimed, and Maribel, a woman once discarded, was now keeper of it all. One afternoon, the mayor from a neighboring town came riding in dust on his coat, disbelief in his voice. "We thought this place was gone," he said, stepping down from his horse. "We heard it burned. Abandoned," it was Maribel replied. "But," how, he asked, sweeping his eyes across the laughing children, the smoke curling from rebuilt chimneys, the garden beds already turned. She smiled, not with pride, but with peace, because someone came back, and then someone stayed. That's all it ever takes. He took off his hat and said nothing more. Later that evening, Gideon handed Maribel a small, roughly whittled wooden plaque. He didn't speak as she traced the carved letters with her fingertips. It read, "Welcome home." No name, no title, just a truth. And as the wind stirred gently through the grass outside, Maribel tucked it above the hearth, right where it could greet anyone still wandering, still hoping, still believing there might yet be a place for them too. Some houses are made from wood and nails. Others are made from choices, from staying, from seeing someone as they are, and choosing them still. Spring arrived slowly but surely, not with fanfare, but with soft thaws and the steady return of color. And in the heart of what was once ruin, Maribel began to feel something she hadn't dared name in decades. Freedom. Not the kind written in law books or promised in vows, but the quiet kind. The kind that bloomed in her chest each morning as she stirred the pot, counted small feet at the breakfast table, or watched Gideon mend a roof beam with one hand and a child laughing at his feet. She didn't belong to anyone now. No man could claim her with coin. No town could shame her for being too old, too barren, or too soft. She belonged only to herself and to the life she had chosen. Still, not everyone welcomed what she was building. One day a telegram arrived, carried by a wiry boy on a mule. It came from her late husband's brother, Charles Beale, a banker from Carson City. It read simply, "Heard you've taken over the land. That house is under family name. We'll be coming to claim it." Maribel folded the paper slowly. Her hands didn't shake. Not anymore. Later that week, Charles arrived with 2 men in suits and 1 sheriff who wouldn't meet her eyes. He stood on the edge of the porch like a man used to getting what he wanted. "You've squatted long enough," Charles said. "My brother left no will. By law, this land returns to the Beale estate." Behind Maribel, 5 children peered out the window. Gideon stood at her side, quiet, one arm crossed over the other. "I've rebuilt what your brother burned," Maribel said, voice low. "This home was made not by deed, but by work, by bread shared, by children sheltered." "What have you brought but threats, legal truth?" Charles sneered. Maribel stepped down from the porch. Her boots crunched over stone, but her shoulders remained square. "Let me tell you something about law," she said. "It may own land, but it cannot own memory, or mercy, or the sound of laughter behind those walls." She looked him straight in the eye. "And you are welcome to walk through this town, but you will not break it again." The sheriff cleared his throat. Then softly he said, "With respect, Mr. Beale, there ain't no court left nearby, and no townsfolk here want her gone. You'll find no help enforcing this." Charles turned red. He left that evening, didn't look back. That night, Maribel stood outside as the wind carried away the last of the cold. The porch creaked beneath Gideon's step as he joined her. "I would have stood in front of you if they tried," he said. "I know," she replied, "but you didn't need me to." She smiled, eyes still on the dark horizon. "No, Gideon, I didn't." And just like that, the last nail that had once pinned her to silence gave way. Sometimes freedom isn't granted. It's claimed quietly by a woman who refuses to be erased. By summer, the earth had turned forgiving. The garden behind the homestead burst into green and gold, rows of beans, fat, squash, even tomatoes so red they looked painted. The children, Tilly, Nate, Ruth, Ezra, and baby Boone, ran barefoot in wild dust on their knees, freckles blooming like sun kisses. Inside the rebuilt house, laughter had become ordinary. So had peace. But on a morning striped with quiet light, Maribel found herself standing in front of the mirror with a dress she hadn't worn in years. It was pale blue with tiny pearl buttons at the neck, a dress once saved for a wedding that never came. Her hands trembled just slightly, not from fear, but from awe. She had never expected to be chosen. She had come to a dead town thinking she might quietly fade into its forgotten corners. Instead, she had planted herself like a seed in burned soil, and somehow love had grown. Gideon waited on the porch, his shirt tucked in, neat, his one good hand holding a single stem of wild lilac. "You ready?" he asked as she stepped outside. "I've never been more ready for anything," she replied, voice calm as sky before rain. They didn't call it a wedding. There were no vows spoken aloud, no preacher, no rings, only a table set under the sycamore tree, 5 children sitting close, the breeze soft like a lullaby. And in the hush of that afternoon, Gideon lifted his glass and said, "To the woman who came to a ghost town and brought it back to life, to the home she built, to the hearts she healed, to Maribel." She blinked, smiled, then cried for the first time in years, not from sorrow, but because finally she'd been seen and stayed for. That evening they danced slowly beneath lanterns strung from the eaves, not gracefully, but with the quiet joy of 2 people who had already weathered life's harshest winds and found in each other the stillness that comes after the storm. And the next morning, well, it was just another day. Chores to do, bread to rise, a fence to mend, life to be lived gently, fully together. Not all stories ride in with thunder or end with a kiss beneath the stars. Some begin with silence and end with something far quieter, a place being seen, a heart being heard. Maribel Lark didn't come to Dovetail with dreams of saving anyone. She just came with what she had: a steady hand, a listening heart, and the quiet courage to stay. And sometimes, that's enough to change everything. The town didn't come back overnight, but window by window, chair by chair, name by name, it did return. And not just because of what she gave, but because she reminded folks of what they still had to offer each other: warmth, time, a second look, a softer word. Even the blacksmith, who thought his hands too broken for hope, found himself reaching again toward her. If you've ever felt too late, too worn down, too forgotten, let Maribel's story remind you healing doesn't rush, but it does return. And sometimes love comes not to rescue, but to sit beside you until you can stand again. If this story touched you, we'd be honored if you'd subscribe to The Nun, Wild West saga, where stories like this find their way home. Would you like to see a part 2, or hear another story about quiet strength, second chances, and the kind of love that grows slowly? Tell us in the comments below. And if this reminded you of someone, feel free to share it with them, because we all need a Maribel now and then.